I found the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and my love of religious academia at the same time, even though they weren't always working together in conjunction.
Hey guys, welcome back to Saints Unscripted. I'm your host, Caitlin.
I'm Cam.
And this is our friend, Louisa. She is awesome. She is out here from Boston. She majored in, mastered in theology from what was the university? Boston?
It was Boston University.
Boston University. Okay. I thought Boston University, but I was afraid I was going to get it wrong. So
I've never heard anyone say I've mastered in it. That sounds really
She got a
cool.
master's in. She has a
master of
the study of theology. So welcome. We're really glad you're here.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. It's kind of a dream of mine.
Yeah, you've been watching the show for a little bit, right?
Yeah, I started watching at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020 when I got sent home from college, and I've been kind of keeping up with you guys ever since.
So where does your story begin as far as learning about the church? Because you were studying religion.
Mm-hmm.
Was that one of the religions you were studying, or was it more like an outside your studies kind of thing?
Yeah, so if we really want to go way back, when I was a freshman and sophomore in high school, that would have been the beginning of my mental health struggles. And one of the main side effects was my schoolwork. And I come from a family of very intelligent, successful people. And I was a pretty intelligent kid, but I just couldn't bring myself to, open my backpack after school. Nothing was getting done. I actually started watching on YouTube John Green. Do you know the Green brothers?
Yeah.
And their crash course videos. And I was so compelled by how much they thought that learning was like fun and exciting. And I wanted to find that. So that was sort of going on one track. And then parallel, I met a boy who, I guess, spoiler alert, is not my husband, but his family, they were the only members in our town. So I grew up in suburban New Jersey, not a ton of Mormons there, but his family were members of the church and I had a massive crush. So I got to know him more in a friend capacity and I went to church with him. And I was more than anything really drawn to the spirit in his home. I did not have that language at the time, but I could see the connection between his faith and his family's faith and the way I felt when I would be in his home. And that sort of got me curious. So I was raised in the Catholic Church, and it was an important part of my family's tradition, but not in a personal, spiritual way. And so I did not feel like I had a relationship with Jesus Christ, though many Catholics do. That wasn't part of my experience. I started to really think about, I'm 16 years old at this point. I've been excruciatingly unhappy for many years and really struggling. And here is this family that has this light and they have this faith. And so I started to think about, what might that look like for me? And how might I find that for myself? Would it have to be in this church? Could it be in another church? Does it have to be a church at all? And that was when I realized, people study religion academically. There are books that you can read. There are papers that people write. There are schools that are dedicated to religion, seminaries, things like that. And so I got really into it and I started any time that there was an English or history project as a high schooler that I could make it about world religions. I chose that topic and I got really into it. So it's interesting because I found the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and my love of religious academia at the same time, even though they weren't always working together in conjunction.
Mm-hmm.
Was there a focus when you first started learning? Was it just, I'm learning everything about every church that I can find? Or was it like, I'm learning about this one specific topic and how it relates to each individual religion?
Yeah. So this is not a great metaphor to use because I have not personally experienced this, but I've noticed in LDS dating culture, a lot of people really want to go on a lot of dates with a lot of different people when they're young. so that they have a lot of experience so that they
Mhm.
can find, the perfect match or whatever. But then sometimes you have people that are maybe dating a couple people, but they have one person that they really like the most. And even though they're giving other people a chance, that's kind of
Their focus.
their favorite, their
Right.
focus, their hope, whatever. So for me, I really did. I really tried to give every faith that I thought I had access to due diligence. And I really tried to learn about them with as much of an open heart and as much of an open mind as I could. But at the back of my mind, since whatever year it was that I was a junior in high school, I had the LDS faith in the back of my mind as what seemed to be the best fit for at least me personally at the time. Part of me, I think, had a gut feeling that this was my home faith, but I didn't feel like it was an option because, the community that I was raised in, all the way out in New Jersey, and I went to a college. I went to Colgate University, which is in upstate New York. It's teeny tiny. It's only a university because you can, I think this is right. You can stay a fifth year and get a master's in education. So therefore it's a university because there's a graduate program. Other than that, it's a tiny liberal arts college.
They went to March Madness. That's the only reason I know.
They
about it.
do tend to go to March Madness,
Really?
which I
That's awesome.
love because, so tangent, my brother went to the University of Notre Dame, which has great sports.
Right?
Yeah.
There was a year, maybe it was this year, you can tell I don't know much, but they didn't make it to March Madness, but Colgate did, and I sort of spinned it as if Colgate was this basketball powerhouse.
For a basketball school.
Yeah, but anyway, Colgate was great. Colgate was what I would consider to be a party school. I'm sure maybe people who went to state schools feel differently, but you could be out at a fraternity party every single night of the week, and there were many weeks that I was. There was a lot of drinking, people were having sex, obviously, before marriage. No one was married in college. And it just felt like that's the way things were. It didn't feel like it was an option to do anything else. But to get back to your question, I really did try and give all the faith due diligence. And I'm so grateful for my academic experience because I had professors, one professor in particular in undergrad, who he didn't want to tell me what religion he practiced, but I always tried to guess. And so every semester I took a different class on a different religion with him. And every semester I thought that was his tradition because he talked about it with such faith and such reverence and such knowledge. And I really learned to feel that's how you should speak about any faith, because
Absolutely.
especially if you're educating other people about that faith. And I'm so grateful that that's how I learned to talk about religion, because when I made my ultimate decision and got baptized as a member of this church, I felt like I did it without any animosity towards any other
disparaging
tradition.
anybody else.
No, and I didn't feel like this is, the best or anything like that, where you're sort of cutting off anyone else's truth or knowledge, So I was grateful for that experience.
Yeah, that is incredible to be able to have that knowledge and really appreciate what's good about all these religions. And so you said that at the time when you were at Colgate and studying, it kind of didn't really feel like an option. At what point did that start to change for you when it felt like an option, when you felt like you could kind of listen to your gut feeling and dive into that?
So to answer that question, I think now would be a really good time to start to maybe lay out the narrative of my mental illness. So I think many years from now, I'll have even a greater perspective, but I very much relate to the woman in the Bible who was hemorrhaging blood for 12 years, because that was about how long my suffering lasted. And so I feel like it really started. So back to John Green, who I referenced earlier, he has a quote saying he had a happy childhood, but he was not a happy child. And that's how I felt. So, I have wonderful parents. I grew up with many resources, opportunities, loving community, great schools, friends. but I had like, I look back and I remember having symptoms of depression as an elementary schooler. And it really came to its peak when I was in high school. And I started to, the plight of any woman nowadays, I realized the value of my body, I guess, and developed an eating disorder. And anyone who's really struggled with an eating disorder knows that that is just a covering over much deeper, darker issues. So I let my eating disorder be the main thing that I let myself wrestle with for many, many years through college. And to my mother's credit, she was amazing. Like at this point, my mother could be a professor to people who are studying to be eating disorder therapists because she became such an expert. But when I got sent home from college in 2020 because of the pandemic, she found an intensive outpatient program, and I did that all throughout COVID. So I ate all my meals on Zoom with a therapist.
Wow.
And my mom found that for me, and it was perfect timing.
Mom.
I was not going to be able to do that and be at school. So thank God, thank my mom, right? Once the eating disorder was out of the way, and thank goodness it's been out of the way since then, I realized that I had really profound mental health issues. And so not to downplay people who have, depression and anxiety, which is so tragically common these days, but also wonderfully being destigmatized and talked about. But this was not that. This was borderline psychosis, banging my head on the wall, pulling my hair, screaming, rage, for years and years and years. And I developed a nicotine addiction to cope and really struggled with building any sorts of relationships, romantic, otherwise. Sorry. And it was really hard. And I really am grateful for the Joseph Smith history story about when he knelt and prayed and in the Hill Cumorah, and before God spoke to him, he was overcome with the most intense darkness. And I'm so grateful for that story because for me, I went through so much darkness to receive so much light. And so I don't remember who asked, but how did I feel ready to receive or to feel like joining this church was an option? I think it was honestly an experience of hitting rock bottom and realizing God has been leading me to this church for so long, and if I ever want to lead any semblance of a normal peaceful life, I have to give this a shot. And so I think that's when I was okay, well, I at least have to try it in earnest, because what people are always really surprised to learn about me is when I was studying religion, and I was mostly studying this church, my undergrad thesis was on the plan of salvation and women's role in the plan of salvation. I wrote multiple papers in my master's degree about the LDS faith. I never read the Book of Mormon cover to cover in that entire time. And people can't believe—
Because you weren't investigating, you weren't meeting with the missionaries at that point.
I wasn't.
You were investigating just as an academic.
Studying.
I met many missionaries and then would ghost them after the first meeting, but I never, to your point, went through— I actually didn't go through the lessons that you have to go through until the week before my baptism.
Oh, no way.
Which is wild, but—
Because at that point, you could have probably taught them.
I know, you would have
That's
known.
what people always say, but I think something that is really important to realize is you cannot even conceptualize what it is like to be a member of this church until you are doing it every single day. There are just so many things that are impossible to understand. And I don't even know if I can give in this moment a specific example,
yeah.
but it I thought, and everyone around me was you know so much about this church. Really, I truly did not. And
a lot of it's culture too.
A lot of it's culture. A lot of it is just thinking about the world and about behavior.
Living every day. just
Yeah.
as a member.
So let me actually, I just thought of an example. The Law of Chastity. Often people will mention the Law of Chastity, and then in that same thought, they'll use the word morality or morals, which was honestly a paradigm shift for me because I was in an environment in which nobody that I knew could have answered, yes, I obey the Law of Chastity, if someone were to ask them that. And to me, that was not a moral issue. I understood the value of obeying the Law of Chastity in the sense of respecting yourself, respecting the sanctity of marriage. But when I think morals, I think like hurting others. And it took me a really long time to understand why, sexual purity and sexual integrity is a moral issue. Like my brain just didn't do that like thought process until I really started to like make and keep those covenants. So I don't know.
That is an interesting example and something that I had not really thought about before, the morality thing. That's so cool.
Yeah. It was like a big thing for me for a long time.
You said rock bottom, right? When was that? Just so we can get an idea of timeline.
This is another thing that used to really make me frustrated because, and I worry when I tell this story that my story will become one of these stories that used to make me angry. There are so many stories of people who go through really hard things with their mental health and they hit one rock bottom experience and then they have one miraculous healing experience and then everything
and then they're
is
fine from that.
And then everything is better. There are so many, even I mentioned the woman in the Bible who bled for 12 years. Even that story can read like that. That is not her story, and I can go into that, but it can read like that. And that used to make me really angry because, I would get, even after I got baptized, I would get a priesthood blessing and I would think this is when the
this
healing.
Is it. This is the one.
And then it wouldn't be, right? Because newsflash, when you get baptized, life does not get perfect. But anyway, so to answer your question, there wasn't one rock bottom experience for me. There were a lot along the way, pre and post baptism. But I think when I realized that like I was willing to risk it all was the spring of 2022. I had a breakup and I was feeling like I didn't have control over my own actions. And that was something, and it was very disturbing to me. Like I felt like I knew what appropriate behavior looks like, and I couldn't bring myself to behave appropriately in terms of treating people kindly and things like that. And I knew at that point that members of this church tend to have high levels of integrity and that is a teaching of the church. And so I could see that connection. And also there is a type of therapy called dialectical behavioral therapy, or DBT for short. And the inventor of it, the genius behind it, Marsha Linehan, uses a phrase, living a life worth living. And I did not feel like my life was worth living. I truly felt if God chose to take away my life, that might be for the best. And that's when I thought it was time to sort of like find some meaning. Because that was another thing. I did not truly understand the plan of salvation the way I do now at this point, even though I'd written a 60-page paper on it. So
you conceptualized it, but you didn't internalize it.
Yeah, I didn't see my place in it.
Right.
Or many people I knew's place in it. So that was probably like the main rock bottom where I felt like I needed to start crawling. Yeah.
And forgive me if this is like jumping too much, but you did mention George Albert Smith. And for those in our audience who are not familiar, he was a prophet of our church, of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints during like the 40s, right? And I love that you have been able to find connection with people in the past based on your experiences, like the woman who bled for 12 years and Joseph Smith's experience. And before we've been on camera, we've talked to you about how you were able to relate to George Albert Smith.
Yeah.
Tell us why that is.
What I love about George Albert Smith is he had many physical ailments throughout his life. So he was next to blind. He had all sorts of stomach issues. I love
Was he blind from the surveying he did? Was he
Yep,
the one?
exactly. And then so he went on to do a lot of great like charity work for blind people, both in and
Mhm.
outside of our church. There's this great like journal entry that he's written that I found through Dr. Woodger's work about how as an apostle, he would travel a lot to visit members and he would stay in members' homes. And the women in these houses have an apostle in their house, right? So they want to cook like these rich, massive meals. But this
Oh.
man has, you know, like the world's worst stomach issues and he can't handle this food, but he wants to honor, you know,
Their
the-
work. And
their work.
Mm.
And so he would have like a crisis at these dinners. Like, do
Oh,
I
poor guy.
wreck my stomach or do I, you know, respectfully eat
which
this
is
meal?
something most missionaries and
I know. I'm
third
thinking,
world
I'm like having
countries
mission
and-
flashbacks
Yeah,
right now.
yeah.
but-
Me as a picky eater, I have like a small sliver of what that feels like. But yeah, so he was really physically unwell. And he also really struggled with undiagnosed mental health issues because at that time, unless you like were considered to be like insane and needed a lobotomy,
or
It like wasn't
institutionalization.
mainstream
institutionalization.
to
Yeah, so if you were
even
like
indicate that
we're either
someone
going to
would
cut your
have
brain in
mental
half
health.
or lock you up for the rest of your life.
Right.
There's no
the DSM-5, I don't think it existed then. There weren't the massive amount of diagnoses and treatments that we have today. But it's very evident that he really struggled. You know, it went hand in hand with his physical illness but he felt massive amounts of guilt because for so much of his time as an apostle, he was bedridden and couldn't bring himself to do the work he needed to do, which did mean that his fellow brethren were doing his job for him.
Mhm.
And all of the documented letters that I have read, his brethren were incredibly supportive and wanted him to rest. But as we know, a calling of an apostle, you are called for life. So it's not like you can say, I'm going through a lot right now. You need to release me. That's not really how it works.
Mhm.
And so he decided to kneel down and pray to God to take his life because he felt like he was not able to lead the church the way he wanted to. And he didn't really see another option for himself. So that's what he asked God to do. And God told George Albert Smith, why don't you bring your wife with you next time you pray and we'll all kneel. You guys can kneel down together and ask me that same question. And Lucy did not, his wife Lucy Woodruff Smith did not lead a cheery life either. And she did not want to kneel down and pray to take her husband's life. But ultimately she agreed, and I'm not exactly sure what that conversation looked like, but God told the Smith couple that he was in fact called to be a leader and that he needed to stick around. And it seems, you know, I was mentioning like, you know, in history often we have these like definitive moments and then everything gets better. For him it didn't. He was sick his entire life,
Yeah, he
but
continued to struggle.
yeah,
Yeah.
but he was able to make a narrative of I'm called to do this, and the rest of his life and his leadership, it seemed to be a lot more positive, of course with pits and valleys along the way, but it's just such an amazing story to me. And there's a quote that I have not memorized that he gave at a general conference session, I think when he was an apostle, where he said, I have been in the shadow of the valley of death and I've been so near to the end, and that's how I know the gospel is true. And that has been my experience. That's what I want for so many people that I meet, is them to know that their struggle and their testimony of their struggle is part of their testimony, right? Like, if we just say the most positive things that happen to us as we follow Christ, we're cutting out so much of the covenant path experience. So I'm so glad.
Well, the New Testament wouldn't be very long if we just took all the
Correct.
happy parts of Jesus'
Correct.
life and that's all we
We'd
read.
have no
right?
Old Testament.
No
and a
atonement,
very-
no.
Yep,
yeah.
no atonement. And that's why, you know, back to Joseph Smith and his experience, like, he struggled. It's part of it. And it's, you know, it's not good. No one wants to struggle. No one wants their loved ones to struggle, but it is absolutely part of living the gospel. It is part of following Jesus Christ. I think that there needs to be a moment in everyone's life where they say, like, can I do this? And I'm so glad that there are people throughout our history who have said, I got to that point, and that's when, Jesus Christ grabbed my hand, right?
Right.
Because look at Joseph Smith, in the Hill Cumorah, like, he went through the darkness and then Christ appeared. And then you look at George Albert Smith, he had to kneel in prayer and God had to say, get up and keep working. And same with me, like, I feel as though I know that Jesus Christ, he didn't stand over the pit and like reach out his hand and pull me out. He got in the pit. And I'm so grateful that that's the gospel that I'm participating in, one where my Savior doesn't like stand up there and kind of like invite me to climb out. Like, he got in there with me. And there've been so many people in my ward and people I've met that have also gotten in the pit with me in the name of Jesus Christ. And I'm just grateful that I am in a church that encourages people to do that in a really earnest way.
To mourn with those that mourn. And
Yeah. Yep.
Was there a moment that made you decide, okay, I want to be a part of this church?
Yeah.
And what were the steps that you took to get there?
Yep. Okay, so I wish that I had like a better story for this part, but yeah, so I was, writing papers and researching various, more like the sociology of the church, really. So like social and cultural norms and movements within the church. And it was interesting and it was important. It's not a great place to start to build your testimony. I'm sitting in class one day. It's my second semester of my master's. I was in a class on, I think it was like an ancient Jewish history class. And I was not listening. And my brain starts to wander. And literally it was as if, someone else jumped into my brain and said, you should contact the missionaries and ask them to read through the Book of Mormon with you. And I said nothing because I was sitting in class. But I opened up my laptop, and this is a professor's worst nightmare. I, open up the internet and I type in, churchofjesuschrist.org or whatever the URL is, and put my name in to contact the missionaries. They called me 5 minutes later.
Whoa.
Which is so funny.
Class?
I wish they were here to tell their side of the story because they had just prayed for a miracle. I think they'd had, dry week, whatever. But they called me and we set up a time to meet, 2 days later. I'm sitting in the coffee shop near my apartment and the elders come in, and again, God's divine timing, it was, what's it called when you swap companions?
Exchanges.
Mm-hmm. It was one of those days. So it was a different elder than this companionship usually had, but I got to meet all three. So the two original and this random guy who came in. And the random guy who came in, who's still a dear friend today, was really like interested in studying the church a little more academically, and was really learning so much. And so I was explaining them my academic background, and they were like, okay, so you know so much about the church, like, where are your gaps? What are your questions? What are your issues? And I said, I just need someone to explain to me why we're telling everyone that Jesus was white, which is like, a common thing that makes people really frustrated.
Right.
And it wasn't so much like that it made me really frustrated, but I was like, why wouldn't we just say what he actually was? Like, it just seemed like inaccurate. But and this elder like slammed his hands down on the table. He's like, I know. And we kind of talked about it, and that didn't end up being the most important thing we needed to talk about. But
because if you weren't aware, Jesus was a Middle Eastern Jewish man.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
No.
Which, I just, I don't know. The Chosen, the actor they've chosen for The Chosen, they're getting there. It's a little closer, but neither here nor there. I was really grateful. That was the start of a trend of these missionaries meeting me where I was and wanting to talk about what I wanted to talk about. So often we would talk on the phone about just my day and like things that were annoying me, like outside of religion. And it would end up tying into the gospel, but they didn't have like an agenda with me. And I'm so grateful because I felt like they saw me as a person and not as like a number,
statistic,
a
yeah.
statistic. But, you know, back to your original question about what made me want to convert, it really felt like all of a sudden my brain was just like, you have to do this. And my testimony was so small, so weak. I did read the full Book of Mormon. I didn't understand it, which is, you know, as a person who has a master's in theology, I fancy myself on being pretty good with scripture, but nothing, it wasn't going in the way I would have liked it to.
Is that frustrating?
Oh my gosh, I would like cry. And the elders sometimes would be like, I think we should take a break. You know what I mean? But
Make it make sense.
yeah, it was really, but like it was frustrating for the wrong like reasons, like pride reasons, you know? But it just was like, I felt like I just needed to, and I had no words to explain it. But I do have to tell this story. The week before I got baptized, my baptism date was set. So I knew I was getting baptized. I was so a little nervous, and I was riding on the train to church because when you're a member in Boston, you have to take, you know, an hour-long train ride to get to your church building. And
Such a different life.
it's a different world, man. So I'm riding the train to church, and I said a prayer. This is so cringe, but I have to tell it. I said a prayer and I said, this whole thing would be a lot easier. This conversion experience would be a lot easier if I could meet my husband sooner rather than later. and I didn't really get a response in that moment, you know, and I felt like gross doing it because, you know, you hear those stories like, God told me you're who I'm supposed to marry, whatever. But I get to church and I'm like, okay, well, I just prayed to meet my husband, so I should probably like sit with a group of boys. So I go and sit with some boys, and you know, I'm like, no, not you.
God
not
helps
you.
those who help themselves.
Yeah, but I'm like, I'm not none of these, you know, none of these guys, right? But then there's this man passing the sacrament, and I look at him, and I didn't feel like, oh, that's my husband, but I did feel like, oh, this person's going to be really significant. And then I kind of forgot about it because, you know, when you're about to get baptized, everyone really wants to talk to you and be your friend. So I had a lot of social engagements that day at church. But then it's time for munch and mingle or linger longer. And I sit down at a random table, and the guy from passing the sacrament comes and sits next to me. And we get to talking, and we exchanged numbers because he wanted to watch the Zoom of my baptism because he was going back to see his family. And, you know, it was one of those things where they're folding up the tables and the chairs, and we're still talking. And then we kind of start making our way into the foyer, and we're like still talking. And I started to have this moment where I was like, this is definitely my husband. But it was very surreal because he was still a stranger, right? And he felt like a stranger, but I also knew that like he wasn't going to be a stranger. So it was like a very, you know, kind of disorienting feeling.
Did he know that?
Oh no,
Okay.
no. He did not have the same experience. But it is my husband from this story. And I'm so grateful that he was there through the whole experience, because being a new member is really hard, and I think I was really disappointed by how hard it was, and I'm not sure if I would, you know, your testimony is not supposed to be in a boy, right? They tell you that. But I'm so grateful that I had him to sort of like lead me and buoy me through it, because I don't think I could have gotten to Christ without him. And so I think the fact that I met him so early on was such a like marvelous gift from God, because it made it possible for me to stay there until like, it was like my husband like grabbed my hand and like led me, and then like Christ grabbed my hand, so that then I got to a point where I was like, well, if some like horrendous tragedy happened, I would not leave the church, you know? I think the thing that I would like to like share as my last thought, if that's okay, is my dear friend. I think she would laugh if this ended up in the video, and I'm not going to drop her name, but there was a time last spring where the Relief Society president was getting released in our ward, and we were wondering who the new Relief Society president was, and she said something along the lines of, maybe I brought up my own name or something, and she said, you know, I think, you know, the bishopric really wants you to focus on helping yourself first, because this was when I was really in the depths of struggling. And I said, no, that is not like perfect health is not a prerequisite for a leadership position in the church. And I told her, and this was a loving conversation, still best friends. And she's a very, aware person of these issues. And so, but I thought back to, or I referenced 3rd Nephi, chapter 11, verse 14 through 17, I think. Christ arrives in the Americas for the Nephites, and he extends his hands and he says, "You all may come forward and put your hands in my wounds." And they do one by one. And then, so they all touch and feel Christ's wounds, and they shout, "Hosanna," which translates to "save us." And so our truth as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is that we are saved because of the wounds of our Savior. Our job as disciples of Christ is to emulate his efforts. And so we cannot help and heal others unless we are able and willing to bear our wounds to others. And that means we need to be willing to be brave and vulnerable. And it also means that leaders and ward members need to trust those who are hurting to be part of the helping as well.
Instead of just kind of pushing them aside and being like, okay, they need time to themselves. Like, we won't worry about extending this to them.
Correct.
But that's actually not really helping the person.
Yeah, because anyone who has suffered from any semblance of anything emotionally hard knows there is nothing better than getting a call, "Hey, can you come help me with something?" Because then you're not thinking about your own distress. You're thinking about it's the best feeling. I don't know that I've coined this term, but my favorite term is like, this is a church of wounded healers led by the most perfect wounded healer. And being wounded is part of perfection, and it needs to be a part of the way we minister to each other.
It's the whole thing of like, lose your life to save it.
Correct. Yeah. And we need to, it needs to be part of it. And I'm so grateful it's been a part of mine and the example of others who have made it a part of theirs.
Louisa, thank you so much. Thank you for coming and sharing your story and having this conversation with us. If anyone has any questions for Louisa, please put them in the comments. Do you have any, I don't know, should they follow you on social? Are you into that? Or
they could. They're not going to see. I don't, it's just kind of like where I go on vacation with my family. But Louisa F. Packham, I think, is my Instagram handle.
Awesome.
But,
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Thank you all for watching. We love you all, and we'll see you next time.